A little bit of the history of the sourdough is the sourdough is an old tradition associated by the Americans with the West and Alaska. It was the treasured possession that sustained the pioneers, the prospectors, and a host of the westward bound frontiersmen. Actually, it was it has been documented in history that the Egyptians started this over 6,000 years ago. So it's been a long time that this tradition has been. We've gotten a new surge of people in today's time that has really become interested in doing the sourdough. And so therefore we're kind of doing this class to see if anybody needs the help. This booklet here is called Today's Sourdough at High Altitude. The original book I helped with in 1971 to 1973, and this was actually the original. But anyway, this is the booklet that we started to do this in 1971-73 with Shirley Porto as our extension agent here in Routt County. And she's the one that put this booklet together with an awful lot of area local women helping to get all these recipes and to test them out and to go through all the things that we needed to do to get it into this form. So, and that started a long, long time ago. So we can be proud of that from Routt County, and it's mainly the high altitude that we perfected, what you could do in this area here. So the recipes of the starters, there's several of them. We have, in this booklet here, is the one that I used for the cinnamon rolls that you're eating. I think all the other girls have used out of this book or this one here. Well, a lot of these recipes in this book came out of this one also. So the starters are in here. There's an awful lot of them out there. You guys can, if you've got a family favorite or somebody else's that has been able to share them with you, you're very lucky. If you don't, it's fairly easy to start. It just takes a lot of commitment to kind of keep it going right at the beginning. So, but my family has always used, in this booklet here, it's called the potato water. And it's in this booklet also, in this book here. But the potato water one is one that my family used. We homesteaded in South Routt in Ujira Park. And I have no idea where it came from. I don't really know anything about it. I just know it was always there. So, but that's the one that we used. And that's what is used for these cinnamons here. So that is a little bit on the starters. And like I said, there's an awful lot of them in our area, a lot of history that goes with those, and they're very enjoyable to kind of pass around. So that's very nice. The recipes, like I said, they in today's is in this booklet here has been revised since 1973 when it came out. It was revised in 1977, again in 1982, again in 1983 with a microwave edition, and in 1991. And I think that's probably the last printing of the book, but they've got them now at the Extension Office, so we can get them through that one, or through the museum here now. The Fair Family Favorites is available through the Tread of Pioneers Museum, the Routt County Extension, and the Routt County Fairgrounds. The recipes that are in here for sourdough is for pancakes on page 194, biscuits 238, the white bread, and that's the one that I used for the cinnamon rolls that you might be sampling, is on page 239. cobbler, which has been back here, is on page 308. And the starter recipe is on page 396, and that's the one that we used for this Seminoles today. So, and then on this one here, the cow pies and cow, it also has a starter recipe different from what is in these books here. And it's from Elaine Gay, and the starter recipe is on page 43 of this booklet. And the biscuits and pancakes recipe is also on page 43 of this booklet. So there's a lot of the books up here that are still available that you can get today. And but there's a lot of booklets out there that's available now on the market for even commercial type. The equipment that you need is very simple. You just need a glass dish, or a crockery, or a plastic, anything that you can put a tight lid on. You can use a fruit jar, you can use any of that kind of stuff to store your starters in. But you always only want to use a wooden spoon or a plastic spoon. You never want to touch any of this with metal, because it goes away. Do not use anything, like I said, with the metal. The starter, you know, when you're cooking and that kind of stuff, like the potatoes, you can of course use a pan. When you're cooking your Seminoles or your breads, you can put it in a metal pan. But the rest of it, you can do that. So anyway, that's a little bit of the history of today's sourdough. If you guys have any questions, yes.
Linda, I hope this, I say there's not such thing as a bad question. What do these different starters do? Do they taste different? They look different? They work differently?
A lot of them are just family handed down from family traditions. You know, they've had them for years.
So it tastes different?
Just a different way that, yeah, probably there are some difference in, you know, in the way that they taste. I have only used myself just the potato water ones, so I'm not really good about saying what tastes, you know, in different ways. So I've only used the potato water, and it kind of gives me a sweet dough, a little better than so much sour. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit to the difference of using high altitude recipes versus, I mean, is the starter geared to high altitude, this particular starter, or?
The one that I used, yes.
Yes.
And like I said, anything out of these books here is geared to the high altitude. On Elaine's, I'm not real positive whether she ends that it came from her family. I may say yes. So I would imagine about any of them in this area that you're going to get are for the high altitude. But these here were tested by a group of ladies, like I said, in the 70s. And we worked very hard to, you know, improve what we could do with them for this altitude and everything, because they came from back east, you know,
right, lower altitude.
Lower altitude. So these have all been tested, and this booklet here is the revised one. You can't get a hold of this one anymore, but this is the revised edition. So, and then what's in this book here has come from this book here. So. I think that most of that will be answered with Karen also. She'll be able to tell you about a lot of the altitudes and what they do to our baking. So, anybody else? Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about why sourdough was so important to early settlers and early pioneers and early miners?
The early settlers, we didn't have yeast, and so the yeast, the only leavening that we had was from the sourdough, and so people figured it out that if they could get it going, it was a starter, and that was the reason it was a prized possession, was that they really protected that, because it wasn't that easy to get it going, and especially in those days, because your best temperatures are around 80 to 85 degrees. And that was with the old wood stoves and that kind of stuff. But when you're out in a wagon or anything like that, it's very difficult for you to get those kind of things. So, but it was very important to the early settlers for the breads and the things that we're using today. So,
What kind of flour would you use?
When you start your starters, you want to use white flour. After that, then you can add rye, wheat, any of those kind of flours to your basic recipe. But when you're starting your starter, you want to use white flour.
If you refill the starter, do you use white or do you use anything you have? You know, if you take away from the starter, you have to put back in.
Right. I always use white flour.
Okay.
And then if I want to make a loaf of wheat bread, then I just add the wheat to the basics. To the basic recipe, yes. So that's when you do it, but to keep your starter going, I use white flour.
So we'll be doing questions at the end with Karen. So Linda, if you have anything.
I think, unless you guys really have something else to ask, particularly to me, I'm going to turn it over to CJ and Chad.
You don't need to clap for me.
It's for Nancy.
Nancy is actually in Lincoln with her sister today, and I got pressed into service. That's why I'm here. And I got reminded this morning at 7 o'clock, don't you blow this, buddy. So, it's my pleasure today to introduce to you Chad Bedell, right here.
Stay up front.
And he's a real quiet guy, and he won't tell you his importance to Routt County history. So he's a fourth generation Routt Countyan. His mother's side of the family is Ornette, and they ranched here, came from Nebraska. His father's side of the family are Bedells. They still live in North Routt County. They had a homestead underneath Steamboat Lake. Okay. His dad, when he was a baby, lived in a cabin that we call the Fry Place. And that cabin is still standing to this day, barely, but it's still standing, so it's cool. So I know he wouldn't tell you all this, and there's more to tell, and we decided we weren't going to tell some things. Because I met Chad when I came here to work on a ranch in 1979, and I met him, he was about her age. Yeah. There's more to that story, but out of respect for all of his kids and the things we don't do anymore, we're just going to let it go at that. And the last thing I want to say, a couple more things. He is also a world champion stair wrestler, 1996 world champion. Okay, right here. The reason he's here, we had his dad over for Christmas dinner, and to say the least, his dad is colorful. Right?
Yes.
And he's the one that spilled the beans that Chad does sourdough, and that's why he's here. So with that, here's a real Routt County icon, so please welcome Chad Bedell.
Great to see so much interest in sourdough. With all that being said, I'd like to say, with all my history here, I'd like to say the family's been doing sourdough for generations, but we have not. So, as part of rodeo, and I was fortunate enough to travel most of the western United States and a lot in the Pacific Northwest, and I guess eating out all the time. The breakfast, one of the staples at breakfasts everywhere is your options is sourdough bread for your toast. So I guess that probably started my penchant for sourdough. But when I quit rodeoing and was able to come back to Steamboat and kind of stay here full time, that's when I kind of got the bug to maybe start Sourdough Starter, start sourdough bread. So that's when I began. I started my first starter in 2003. I was not a good shepherd, so it made it 2 years, and I fed it here and there, and then neglected it a lot, and my starter died. So then in 2005, I started my new starter, and this is what it lives in. So I've fed this starter for, what's the math? 13 years now. This was January of 05 that began this. Thank goodness Mrs. Long's covered a lot of the basics that need to be covered. No metal, you keep it in ceramic or plastic. This lives in this ceramic crock, stays in the refrigerator. I feed my starter, the first starter that died, I neglected it. I try to feed it every 2 to 3 weeks. I found that when my starter stays the healthiest is when I just make it an objective to bake every week. So every Sunday I'll bake bread. So I'll bake bread, I'll take from my starter. I use 1.5 cups in my recipe. I feed that starter with milk and flour. I started mine with milk. You can start them with water. I started mine with milk, and I continue to feed it with milk. Milk, and I just use all-purpose white flour. I'm not very adventurous. I don't care for wheat bread, so I cook white sourdough bread, and that's what I make. These resources you have here are fantastic to make cinnamon rolls. About the only other thing we use ours for is my wife and my mother like to use mine for pancakes. So they'll steal a few tablespoons, however much they want, to make pancakes for the kids in the morning. Otherwise, I pretty much stick to bread. And that's kind of my routine. Like I say, I try not to neglect it and let it go more than 3 weeks. I start to remind myself I better check that. You can tell in the starter too, it's bubbly, it has a real good aroma to it, a good smell. And if you neglect it and it starts, when bacteria start to die and slow down, it'll start to get a watery film on top. You'll notice that it's not as healthy as it should be. So it's time to get in gear and give it some food. So.
Can you revive it, you mean, if it goes?
Well, sourdough is bacteria and, well, yeast, natural yeast, out of the air, and lactobacillus. So that bacteria eats the flour and milk for food, gives off gas, and when it gets low on food, you need to give it more. So if you're going to keep a continuous starter going like I do. It is a labor of love. If you're going to be traveling a lot and off seeing the world for a couple of months at a time, might have somebody feed it for you, because it might not survive. But, so, lost my train of thought on what I was going to.
Does it need to breathe?
I cleaned this up. I took the starter out, put it in a bowl, and then I cleaned this up, because as I feed this and it gets really good and lively, it does bubble over. It'll bubble right out of this crock. So this crock will get just caked sourdough on the outside, but I love it. I know it's healthy and it's living and doing well. But I did clean that up today to bring in. I probably should have left it as is. It would have been more authentic. Part of the bread making is just part of my bread making regimen. Is before you bake your bread, you will make a sponge. And so I brought just a sponge from last night. And should we pass that around?
What's it mean, a sponge?
What is a sponge?
The sponge is sourdough starter and flour. And I use, to get my bread to rise at this altitude, I use active dry yeast. So that'll have a little bit of yeast in it. And then I put a tablespoon of honey in there. To sweeten it, a lot of the recipes call for sugar. I like to use honey, so I'll use that. You can kind of smell the aroma off that. That's an active working sourdough culture. And then you let that sponge sit in the refrigerator for overnight, 8 to 12 hours. And then when you begin your bread, you'll take that sponge out, then you'll add that to your main body of flour. I'll add 2 teaspoons of kosher salt to slow down. The kosher salt slows down the fermenting process. So it just doesn't balloon and skyrocket out. And then I'll add 1 more teaspoon of yeast to that when I bake bread. I'll let that rise for 2 hours. Usually to get it to rise, I always keep mine in an oven rack, and then I put a baking dish underneath, add boiling water to that baking dish in the oven, lock it in there to keep humidity in there so it doesn't get a hard film on it as it rises. My favorite tool for my bread rising is this little contraption here. This came with a food saver kit, and it has a cap, and it's to suck out air for a food saver kit. But anyway, I hijacked it, and this is what I use for my bread making. lightly grease this. My dough ball goes in here. This is a patented quantity level. That's where your dough ball, the level, and when that dough ball doubles in size or better, so if it's real active and it's a good day, I've noticed my sourdough, a lot of factors affect how it rises, and if you guys are bread makers, you probably know just as well. The outside temperature, if there's a lot of drafts coming into the house, the barometer, the outside temperature that day, a lot of factors affect how fast it will rise. But this is what I use, one of the best things I've ever got to make bread. So, and then I'll pound that down. After it's risen 2 hours, pound it down, and then I'll divide it into my loaves, put it in the loaf pans, let it rise. Usually an hour. If it's slow, if it's cold, needs a little more time, let it rise more. And then the end result is your sourdough loaf. You'll bake that for 40 minutes at 350. The bread that was out for samples back there, the one with yeast, that's what I use, the active dry yeast, to get that bread to rise. And I'm not sure about the bread makers, and Mrs. Long could give you a lot more information. One thing I found about my bread is I have to at least double the yeast in my recipes at this altitude to get it to rise in a decent time. The other bread was just a straight sourdough recipe, just used a little baking soda to try and get it to rise, and it's an all-day ordeal. It took 4 hours just to get my dough ball to double. And then it took a long time to get it to rise in the pan. If you notice the bread, the straight sourdough is very compact, very tight, and very dense. The one that uses the active dry yeast gets a little bit of honeycomb in there, not like commercial bread, but it does get a little bit in there. Yeah. Other than that, sourdoughs are great, fun. It's fun for me. But like I say, if you're going to make a starter that you're going to feed and keep on hand every day, it is a labor of love. This starter was started with just the wild yeast out of the air. It was started with 2 cups of whole milk. You let that, just cover it with a cloth, set it in the windowsill in the sun, let it sit there for a day. Then you'll stir in 2 cups of flour. And then you'll cover it again, put it back there, and just let it stay warm and start to bubble. When it gets to bubbling and gets real active, you'll smell that fermentation. Just stir it every day for 3 or 4 days, and when it's good and healthy, you'll label that and put it in your fridge and have it forever. How many of you have sourdough starters? How did you start yours?
Well, mine was given to me in 1969.
Wow.
That's great.
By my next door neighbor, so I've had it since 69.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
You got the starter?
You can start sourdough just with whole grain rye, whole grain wheat, and water, and you never have any milk. And online, we'll show you how to do that. You just keep adding water, keep adding it. And the microbes that are in the whole grain rye and the whole grain wheat will give you your sourdough.
The protein, yes.
Can you just talk a little bit about your feeding? Like when you're feeding your starter, is that something really fast and you put it back in the fridge, or does it have to sit outside and kind of warm up with it? Like how's that process?
When I feed mine, like I say, if I'm in my bacon regimen, I'll just use my 1.5 cups for my recipe, and then I'll put a cup of flour back in, a cup of milk. I'll stir that good and back in the fridge.
Back in the fridge.
And then during the week, each day it gets a little more active. The refrigerator slows down the fermentation on it. But yeah, beat it and put it right back in the fridge. Yeah.
What determines how sour it is? I want a really sour one.
From what Karen can answer that. I've noticed on my starter, if it's a long period between when I use it, it tends to get a little little more fermented and a little more acidic, and yeah, it gets a little more taste to it. So, yeah.
Oh, is that crock available, something like that? Is it specifically for?
No, it's not. This is just a basic crock that comes. I started mine in an antique crock, which was my preference. It's a beautiful antique crock. It takes up space in the refrigerator, and so my wife informed me that now I would be using this crock. They do. They make some, yeah, fantastic old antique crocks are great. Yeah.
So, I don't live in high altitude. I live in like no altitude. But I find when I make my bread, and I've never made a sourdough, that I have to add gluten to and use very high protein breads, you know, the bread flour, plus gluten, in order to get the structure for after it rises for it not to drop. And I don't know if that's a situation.
I can answer that.
Yeah, I'll let Karen answer that. Any other questions
I have one.
about? Yeah.
How many loaves of bread do you get from one batch?
I'll get 2 of these pan loaves.
Okay.
Or if I really enjoy making it on a pizza stone and just I'll make long French loaves, or I'll make just one big one.
Okay.
I like it that way, but these are more efficient for storage. Another thing about sourdough that Karen might get to when she talks is I've noticed that the sourdough breads have a lot longer shelf life than the commercial stuff. The commercial breads just spoil very quickly. The sourdough lasts a long time. Yeah.
I just had a couple comments. I've had sourdough that was passed down to me through several generations. And how we keep ours going, well, how the previous generation kept it going, is every Sunday they invited friends over and they had sourdough pancakes. And so they were using it every single week.
Yeah.
And then as the Postons became older, they gave my father part of it. And then my father started making bread and pancakes, and he made sure he did it every week. And that kept it going. And then when I married, my father gave it to me, so he wouldn't have to babysit it all the time. And I kept it going since the 60s, but I learned by reading that you can put it in the freezer. And it will revive. I'm sitting in Minnesota right now in the freezer.
Yeah. That's good to know.
But also, I have a humorous story about passing it on, and somebody just asked me, how do you get that sourdough flavor? You know? I think, from what I've read, it comes from the yeast that you've gotten, and our yeast came from Alaska, from the early gold people, and then went to San Francisco and was in San Francisco for decades, and then the Postons got hold of it and they brought it to Wisconsin, etc. But friends wanted sourdough, and they liked my sourdough when they came and visited. So they went home and they made pancakes. They made their own sourdough from scratch, and it just didn't taste right. So they came back and visited me, and they said, "Would you give us some of your sourdough? Yours just tasted, you know, more like we thought sourdough." So I gave them some, and they put it in a jar. We only filled the jar about a third full, and they put it in the trunk of their car. Sourdough. It crawled out of the jar. It had sourdough all over the baggage.
That's good. And Karen can fill you in more. It's my understanding that sourdough uses the yeast and lactobacillus out of the air, and that's all unique to whatever area you're in. So San Francisco sourdough is just, it's the yeast that are in the air there that gives it that flavor. Ours will have another flavor here. And then I'll turn it over to Karen, but I'll give you my tragic sourdough story. My ex-sister-in-law is an old Irish family. And the family had had sourdough for a long time. The starter was, in the story I heard, it was over 100 years old. And the family had had it in the family, and the grandfather kept it. So the grandfather was still living by himself and started to have difficulty taking care of himself. So they hired a house cleaner. So you can see where this is going. The house cleaner came, checked the refrigerator, opened the crock jar, and it smelled terrible. Pitched it in the trash, and there went over 100 years of sourdough. I'll let Karen tell you.
All right. For my part, I'm looking out here, and I know all of you know how to bake bread and how to deal with sourdough. And in fact, a few of you, I'm like, oh, I'm hoping that she's here so we can have a conversation. I am not here as an expert. I am the former director of the Extension Office, Family Consumer Science Agent, retired for 3 months. It's going pretty good. But then I'm back here because this is what I love. The fact that you guys want to learn about sourdough is fabulous. Let me tell you a little bit about my background with sourdough. I grew up in a family where we had sourdough from time to time, but my family and I lived on a sailboat for 4 years in the early 2000s, 2002 to 2005. While I was on my sailboat, down in Honduras actually, a fellow sailor gave me a gift of sourdough starter. And she told me at the time that that sourdough starter had traveled the world. And I made about 10 batches of sourdough starter to share with people, but I'm retired. If you guys want some sourdough starter, I will make sure that we get it to you. I'll work with Candace and the Extension Office, and we can make sure that you have a little of this world-traveled sourdough starter. You do not need to have somebody give you sourdough starter, although it is fun to have the history and to have, and that 150-year, oh, that's such a bummer to lose that. But I have been told that if you buy a sourdough starter in San Francisco, by the time they analyze it in New York City or Denver, Colorado, or Steamboat Springs, it's taken on the natural bacteria of your environment. So, in fact, there are a lot of people who think, well, you know, is it just wild fermentation when I have let mine kind of die a little bit in the refrigerator and I try to revive it up? I'm not really sure if what I've done is revived it or just it had a chance to re-inoculate with the natural bacteria and yeast. I do not know. But I like the story of the world-traveled starter, so I'm going with that one. But I do think that when I had some sourdough starter and we bought a new sailboat, we're going to go sailing again. I bought some new sourdough starter, and when I tried to revive it in a brand new boat that had never been cooked in or no food or anything, it did not revive. And that's what made me think, yeah, I need to kind of cook in this galley a little bit and mess it up a little bit so I have some natural stuff. What makes sourdough work? And first of all, why do you want it? Absolutely true that the acidity of sourdough, it inhibits molds. And so true sourdough bread will last longer, absolutely. It'll have less mold growth than a traditional bread. I like the flavor, that rich, complex, somewhat sour flavor that you can have in a pancake. Put a little blueberries in there. I am going to adopt it's for the sake of the sourdough starter, every Sunday we're having sourdough pancakes. That's my new mantra. I love it. Because I do struggle with trying to figure out how to keep it fed. What is in that sourdough starter, though, is basically, in mine, water, flour, and nothing else. And what happens is in flour, and particularly rye, but wheat flour as well, is that there are natural wild yeasts and bacteria. And they have a synergistic effect with each other. The bacteria breaks down the carbohydrates, and that's what the yeast feeds on. And between the two of them, they create this just symbiosis of life in this just very basic thing. And I do know some people use milk, people use other things, but you don't need to. It can just be flour and water. And that's what is in mine. It's just flour and water. As you care for this, this starter, it's a live thing. Now, I have loved experimenting with fermentation. Have any of you ever done kombucha tea, anything like that? Dadgummit, you know, my kids have grown and gone away. Do I need another child? That kombucha took over my life. At least with sourdough, there are ways to kind of put it to bed a little bit until you're ready to use it. You can freeze it. When I go down to our boat, I've dried mine. There you go. That's what I do. I dry. You dry yours? And how do you revive it? You just put the,
just put it in some warm water and let it sit.
Okay, stay tuned, I'll let you know.
Because I mail it to people.
Yeah.
I dry it on.
Go to the extension office, borrow their dehydrator. No. I just make the, well, that's what I do. Because I made like 4 things of it.
Spread it on a piece of wax paper, parchment paper. Let it dry.
There you go.
A little bit of time.
Yeah, you can just, but it needs to dry thoroughly, and as in any dried anything, I put it in a jar after I've dried it, I close it off, and what it does is it evens out the moisture, and so that's what I've done here. I'll put it in a bag, take it down to the Bahamas, and I'll let you know how my sourdough goes. But you can save it a lot of different ways. I do not bake every week. I put mine in the refrigerator, and then I pull it out and I feed it once a week. And sometimes it's once every 2 weeks. If I go too much further than that, it's a little bit of a problem. As your sourdough starter kind of dries out, it develops a little kind of a gray liquid on top, which I've always called hooch. And it is truly alcohol. And you can stir it back in. You can pour it off. What do you guys do with the hooch?
Stir it in.
Stir it in?
I pour mine off.
You pour your off? See? Now let me just go back and say, sourdough is much more of an art than it is a science. And everything I read something that said that when you have a new sourdough starter, you have to feed it every 12 hours. Well, let me go back to my previous statement about I've raised my kids. You know, I'm not going back to that. It'll do fine once a day when it's a new starter. When I was getting ready for creating all of these, I was adding equal measure of non-chlorinated water. So if you use city water, I would use bottled water instead. If you use your tap water, I set it out for several hours and let the chlorine dissipate, because the yeast does not do well with chlorinated water. What do you guys use as a water source?
Well, I was going to say, I learned from experience that if you have an RO, don't use reverse osmosis for your drinking water. Don't use that.
Really?
It takes the minerals out. Sourdough needs minerals. And the other thing I was just going to suggest while you're holding that is, did you put saran wrap?
No.
Okay. There should be saran wrap between the lid and that, because it's metal.
Okay, so here's the next thing. And you guys have talked about metal. The acidity of sourdough reacts with metal.
Yeah.
So we tend not to use metal pots, metal utensils. I have always used it this way. I have a question about holes. I have always known that I always put holes in the top of my jars.
Oh.
And I have done a fair amount of research in the last week or two getting ready for this. Not once did anybody suggest that you need to have it breathable. Do you have yours breathable?
I do it when I really want to revive it. What I do is I just put cheesecloth over my container.
And you put it in the refrigerator?
No, I leave it out on my counter. Okay. You know, to get the.
But when I store mine in the refrigerator for years, I've done it this way.
I do.
I keep it below the level of the metal container. But those of you who take some of this home, care for the concept
But
of.
I found it'll pit, it'll pit the top
Yeah.
if you're not careful.
So what, if you have a well and have a water softener, will that store your water to do it?
I don't know. On our sailboat, we have a water maker. We actually have a desalinization unit. That absolutely takes out all the minerals. So I'm going to have to pay attention to that.
I went to a cooking class at King Arthur that was just sourdough. And I occasionally have issues with it not really working, and the lady there said, try it with just your tap water instead of the RO, and it's worked better.
Just leave it and let the chlorine dissipate.
I'm on it.
Yeah.
If you wanted to make a bread and not use yeast, use just the starter, which I think I heard earlier. Use the sourdough in place of yeast. What's the proportions of that you would put in?
You know, there is, to me, it is absolutely an art. One of the baskets of bread back there is the one that I made. I make bread. Do any of you ever do that no-knead bread technique that you do in a cast iron Dutch oven? Okay. I wanted to make that recipe only with sourdough, and so I played around with it and I cut it into slices because it turned out to be really flat. I needed more flour in it, but the fiber, but the structure I thought was good. Did you guys see that one, the big holes?
Yes.
That's what I like. I like the big holes, and I did not use any additional yeast in that one. And so I'm going to keep playing around with that, because to me that's the challenge, is can I get this to rise without adding any yeast? You know, if I wanted to make sure it rose, I probably should have added. But I like those big holes, kind of like a, what is a ciabatta bread, the big holes in the bottom. Yeah.
It was very good.
And then the other reason I like it is just the flavor. Now, when you have a sourdough starter, we talked about the yeast. And the yeast is going to break down, cause carbon dioxide and big bubbles. But at about 140 degrees in your oven, that yeast will die. And so what you have then is just whatever structure you have made around your bread. So the question I have, and I don't know the answer to, what kind of flour do you use at altitude? Do you use bread flour, which is a little higher in protein? Now, when you ask about, I think you were talking about vital wheat gluten, which you can get in a package right by the the flours. I have heard that that is a real important thing to add at altitude, particularly if you're doing whole grain baking. Do you use, no?
I use bread flour.
Okay, so bread flour?
I'm at zero, literally, I live in Miami, 0 altitude. And my bread will drop unless and once I started putting in the vital, gluten, it stops, so I don't even question, there goes 2 tablespoons, whether it's bread, combination of bread flour and wheat flours or rice, no matter what.
But that is a function of adding a little bit more protein. So if you're at altitude and you're trying to do some baking, that might be an answer to having it, improving the structure. Yeah?
I make bread and I do a combination of whole wheat and white, but always unbleached white flour. And the tan package with the green writing on it. I don't remember which one that is. I think it's called high altitude flour. Anyway, so I'll mix those together equally, and I haven't had a problem with it rising.
Good.
And I don't add any gluten.
And you don't use bread flour.
And I don't use bread flour.
I have a question. Oh, probably 20, 25 years ago when our daughters were in elementary school, that we got something similar to this. We call it Hermann. Does that ring a bell at all?
Hermann?
I remember the Hermann craze back in the late 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Was that
similar?
It had to be very similar, but
Yeah.
I've wondered that myself. But Hermann, they gave you several recipes.
Yeah.
You had to feed it once a week, I think, all, and then you had to give half of it away.
Yeah.
Is that like a friendship bread? Only yours was called Hermann.
Yeah.
Got it.
That was in Michigan, I don't know.
You know, it is possible to have a sourdough starter go bad. If you see any kind of red or pink streaking in it, throw it out. It should not have mold on it. As I said, that's part of the beauty of it. If you have mold on yours, I was looking at something online and somebody was talking about their moldy sourdough starter. I'm like, that's not right. Now you can, somebody asked about adding or changing the flavor of it a little bit. The bacteria, the lactobacillus, will break things down into lactic acid, which is kind of a, I think more of a kind of a buttery, softer acidity taste, and then the acetic acid, which is more of a vinegary taste. And the bacteria that grows the best at room temperature is the lactic acid. So if you wanted to make it a little bit more sour, then you should try to ferment it in the refrigerator overnight. And that is the environment that the acetic acid does the best at. You end up with a little bit more sour flavor that way.
3 or 4 days.
Is that how long you do it?
Oh, yeah. Back in the fridge, and then you pull it out every once in a while, let it come up to between 50 and 60 degrees, put it back in.
Okay, so you mentioned going online. Do you have any resources that you use? I have some I use online.
Sure.
King Arthur flour.
Breadtopia.
They have their whole, they have
And then
their
there are just chat rooms. I forget the names of them, but you know, master bakers all over.
But it is just, there is so much art to it. That just getting into these chat rooms, going to King Arthur Flour, they have a fabulous website, and actually they have an ebook that is kind of how to work with sourdough. There's another place that I've used that's called Cultures for Health, and you can actually buy a sourdough culture there as you can with King Arthur Flour.
Another good resource might actually be a website called Reddit. I know that when I was making kombucha, there was an entire forum completely dedicated to that.
Conversations about it.
They would send you starters all the time, like if you just asked for it, somebody's like, yeah, I make an excellent starter, you can have it. Probably the same thing for sourdough. I would definitely imagine sourdough.
Probably.
Can you talk about relationship with kneading and how that affects the texture?
So the kneading is really a method of developing the protein in the bread. And the whole idea with the no-knead bread craze, and maybe it's not a craze anymore, I think that was a New York Times article 10 years ago. But the idea behind that is that you don't want to over-knead the bread, and you want it to remain soft enough to get those big pockets. But it's how you develop the gluten in the bread. So what I have heard recommended is less of a kneading and more of a kind of a folding, particularly with this version that I had, so that it's still working things in, but folding it rather than
If you've ever kneaded it, what's it going to look like? If I can change it.
Usually you're adding more flour at that point. What are the tips for knowing when it's properly kneaded?
Well, the same way, stick your finger in it?
If you put your finger in and it pops back up, you're ready to roll.
The thing that most people do is they add too much flour. I mean, especially if you're making a sourdough that you really want to get a bunch of oven spring, it's going to end up being a slack, really a slack dough. I mean, if it's really cohesive and it's holding together, you've got too much flour in it. Because if you want to develop those big holes,
yeah,
it's a slacker.
The reason this bread I liked had the big holes is because I baked it with the lid on for the first half hour, which actually was more of a steam experience.
Well, that's how I do my bread. I put it on a stone, that's been heated for an hour, and I spray my oven with a, you know, a spray, and throw some ice cubes in the bottom and set the timer for 5 minutes and spray it again and throw some more ice cubes in it. At King Arthur, they have you heat a cast iron pan on the bottom of the oven, and you throw the ice cubes in that.
Lisa, that just sounds like one heck of a lot of work.
But I mean, but you get the nice artisan frosty. Well, you've seen my bread.
Yeah, this is beautiful. You had one more comment, Mecca.
Yeah, you bake by weight, weight of your liquid and the weight of your dry material. And if you really want the big holes, you go to 80% hydration, basically.
Much more moist than anything you could do a lot of.
And if you just let it volatilize, and all you have to do, you know, a couple periods of volatilization between a half an hour each or 45 minutes, and then it will come together, just a couple movements, and it's nice and smooth and looks like it's been kneaded for
a long time. So I have a few resources I am going to leave here. I have a handout for those that get my starter, is the Karen feeding handout. There is a recipe that I thought looked pretty good from King Arthur flour called rustic sourdough bread. It does include a little yeast. And then there is something that I pulled off of the Splendid Table, which is a radio show that I like, that is how to start your own sourdough starter. So these handouts are up here, and after everybody is done, it would be nice to have some conversations about sourdough. There's some great stories in here we didn't get to. One thing I do want to also mention is that if any of you have your own products that you want to sell directly to people, we have a food safety class for cottage food producers, and it can be bread or jams or something. If you want to make a little business for yourself and you're interested in one of the food safety requirements for that, there is a class coming up on the 29th of this month that I will be teaching. So.